Hi everyone, it's Quinn Russ again from MSCM 1250, section Oil 1, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the first three chapters of our book here entitled Communication Making Connections, ninth edition by Seiler, Beal, and Mazur, published by Pearson Education out of Upper Saddle River, New Jersey, copyright 2014. These first three chapters are all regarding making connections through communication. The first chapter talks about connecting process and principles. The first thing that's important to understand is exactly what communication is. And communication, according to this book, is the sharing and creating of meaning through symbolic interaction. So, of course, every sound, every letter, every number, it's all a symbol that has a meaning that we are able to receive from it. Now, as far as connecting process and principles, the principles that this chapter talks about are, first of all, the fact that communication is a process instead of something that just happens without any sort of systemized composition to it. Also, communication is a system. It has a lot of moving parts in that are all dependent on each other, and of course, they can only function in tandem. Also, communication is transactional. So, in other words, that means that communication can function in two directions, both at the same time. And finally, the principle that they emphasize is that communication can be either intentional or unintentional. Good example of that would be whatever message you are receiving, or whatever feeling you have as soon as you see my face or what I'm wearing right now or my facial expression. That could be what the message that I'm trying to send, or it could be not necessarily the message that I'm trying to send, but either way, it is the message that you are receiving. So that's a good example of how communication can be either intentional or unintentional. Now, as far as the process, there are certain steps and aspects in the process of communication. Of course, it starts when the sender of a message creates the message. And while that message is being transmitted from the sender to the receiver, once in a while there might be some type of interference that actually changes the meaning of the signals that are being sent. And of course, in that process, there's always a channel through which messages are both transmitted and received. Now, of course, the receiver, once they get hold of the message, they have to analyze it and make sense out of it and decode it so that it is understandable to them and makes sense to them or him or her. And then finally, there's feedback, not necessarily the last thing that happens. Sometimes it can be something that happens even when a different function is being carried out. And feedback is, well, as you all know, that's the messaging that is given back to the original sender in response to the message that was originally sent. So that's all regarding the principles and the process of communication. The next chapter, in chapter 2, talked about connecting a perception and communication. So first of all, perception is the not necessarily fact. It can be a fact, but it is not necessarily fact. Like I said earlier, is what the receiver makes out of it. Is what the receiver uh, is able to. It's the way the receiver understands the message that has been sent. Um, and so the reason that it's important to understand what a perception is because different people have different perceptions. One person might understand the message a certain way, another person might understand the message a different way. And so that's why one of the most important things in regards to connecting perception and communication is to separate perception from fact, as the book says. So don't necessarily assume that the way you understand something or the way you interpret something is the way everybody else interprets it, because a lot of times that is not the case. Also, another important thing that it says is to communicate to verify your perceptions. And that is actually another thing that's good about practicing and talking to people. Another thing that is good that this class points out, because I know, especially for all of those shy people out there, including myself, I'm naturally a shy person. Sometimes we're not very quick to ask questions. We might be afraid that someone will tell us that our question is a stupid question. But of course, I've also heard people say that the only stupid question was the question that was never asked. So those are some very important things that stuck out to me when I read in chapter 2 regarding connecting perception and communication. And then last but not least, there was in chapter 3 that talked about enhancing self-concept. And when it talked about enhancing self-concept, it basically defined what self-concept is. And in layman's terms, self-concept is what one, what one thinks of oneself. And when I say that, what do they, how do they view themselves? Not necessarily whether they think of themselves as good or bad, but overall, what do they think of themselves? Do they think of themselves as a man first, or a soldier first, or a student first? That type of thing. But the overall way that they view themselves. And so it talks about enhancing self-concept, in other words, improving self. There are about 6 different methods and parts that it points out here. It says, first, decide what you want to change about yourself. And of course, that would be important, because then that way you'll have some kind of purpose to build on. And it says, describe why you feel that you want to change something about yourself, and that also adds to the purpose. It says, make a commitment to change, and that's always important. Anytime you want to do something that is not necessarily easy, and of course, a lot of us know that it's not easy to change. But if you make a promise to yourself and to the people around you that you will put in the effort that is required to change for the better, then you're that much more likely to make that change. Next, it talks about setting reasonable goals for yourself. And a lot of us, sometimes we might get impatient and try to expect things to happen overnight, or in one day, or even in 1 hour. But of course, sometimes the best things take more time. And so it has to be very realistic approach, and it takes time. So it's important to have that patience that is required for things and that take time. Now, it also talks about deciding on specific actions. So in other words, it recommends setting up a plan. Say, I'm going to take this step and this step and then that step, and try to decide step by step, either before you start making those changes, or if necessary, you can make up the plan as you move along and adjust accordingly. As long as you're keeping that promise that you made to yourself to change, and also keeping adhering to that purpose that you decided and that you agreed upon. Also, it mentions that you should try to associate with positive people, and it says that people who understand you, people who are easy for you to communicate with, and in some cases, people who have an easy time communicating with you, vice versa. They are the ones who are more likely than others to provide a significant assistance in helping you to make that change. And so I guess the biggest thing to take from these first 3 chapters regarding communication, the things that it said that stuck out to me, were that communication is something that we often take for granted, and that's not necessarily the way it should be, but that's the way it is. But we take it for granted, and we just assume that since we've been talking since we were 4 years old, that we know everything there is to know about getting our point across. However, this text does give some pretty good examples about how, if we read into the nature of communication and read into the finer details of communication just a little bit more, and try to draw connections between that content and our own lives, then that will help us to identify specific methods to improve how we communicate. Some of these things I already knew, I'll admit, but then there are some things that I had forgotten. And it had not really been in the forefront of my mind for a long time until I read it in this book. So I thought it was a pretty eye-opening experience. And I hope you guys enjoyed these readings as well. And thank you for your time.